detail with maps. But the organization emerged out of the North Branch Park River Watershed Management Plan, which was completed in 2010. It was a study of the North Branch Park River Watershed, and it was funded because of a violation, because of a combined sewage overflow that happened within the watershed. And citizen stewardship organizations have been extremely successful across the United States in garnering support for urban rivers. I have to say, they're really, urban-suburban watershed stewardship is an evolution of the watershed stewardship movement that began around recreational rivers like the Farmington River, monumental areas, the Long Island Sound, the Boston Harbor, places where people had recreational and also fisheries interests. It's interesting because a lot of people bring those aspirations to the Park River. The kayaking of the conduit, the exploration of the river. There's an aspiration, but the reality of it is that many urban suburban watersheds are impaired, and there's real hazards. So Kristen picked this photograph of kayakers going into the South Branch conduit, and it's so fascinating to me because as much as I would like to do that, I have very sensitive skin, and I can't go into the conduits. One, because I know there's 22 combined sewage outfalls there, so there's a lot of contamination in the conduits. They're fairly dangerous due to some hazards, some open shafts that drop down 40 feet. Of course, there's no radio contact or light in there either. But the compelling interest in recreational rivers is so fascinating, because isn't that what we all want in the end? We want our rivers we can walk to, that we can boat, that we can swim in, that we can fish in. We all need clean water. In urban areas, I think the real pressure right now is to recognize how important it is to save these last landscapes. And so even though we may aspire to recreation, and throughout the summer, I've been noticing there's some youth who are teenagers who are going down to the river and swimming in the river. And of course, people are trying to like bicycle on these like footpaths or whatever along the river. But we really need to ramp up, I think, this sort of understanding that these last landscapes in cities are especially important for habitat. And they provide forest areas, they provide migratory birds, home insects. I'm going to move my picture up here so you can see insects, very critical part of the ecosystem, aquatic life. And so this is a picture of the North Branch on a winter day. And so you can see kind of the structure of the riparian corridor. And it's also the connectivity along the riparian corridor that becomes so critical and to life, and that increasing connectivity. So here's just a slide. I'm not sure this I can do anything about this bar, which is going to wind up right in the middle of my my headings. But the habitat really is key, and the 88% of the endangerment of imperiled species across the United States is really due to habitat destruction. And for that reason, it seems that maybe the call for urban suburban riparian corridor stewardship, it ought to be as much to save living environments in our residential areas as it is for recreation. But there's I think whatever brings people to the table. This is a photograph from the New York Times in September, and I feel like, again, we can't turn away from what's happening. There's a lot of call for issues around climate change, but again, the climate change is really impacting our native species. And our urban-suburban riparian corridors are critical to providing some habitat, some refuge. And I think we can start to speak up about that, just like a lot of housewives once spoke up about not wearing hats that had birds and helped bring about the Migratory Bird Treaty over 100 years ago. So how do we do that? That's a big question. This whole presentation is a sort of review of how do we conserve a riparian corridor within an urban-suburban context successfully, and include all the different aspirations people have, such as recreational interests, such as habitat interests, such as achieving clean water goals. And it's fascinating when we can look back to the past and we can see efforts to do that in the past. So this is Central Park, this collage here, this rectangle, very clear, very obvious park area, Central Park in New York City, set aside by Frederick Law Olmsted as a designer, but purchased by a number of private property owners. And then in Boston, this is the Back Bay Muddy River emerald piece of the emerald necklace. I don't know if we call it the Fens, but it's currently being restored, and it's a series of landscapes that connect Jamaica Pond to the Arnold Arboretum and to Franklin Park in Boston's Back Bay. And these two Olmsted landscapes, these were Olmsted projects of the late 19th, early 20th century. If we combine those together, you can see at scale, they are basically relative to the North Branch of the Park River. So down here, this is Hartford High, and then this is the 5-mile stretch of the North Branch of the Park River, which is in Hartford city limits. So it's all within one municipality, the impaired riparian corridor. And that is what I'm currently advocating now, especially as we enter the threshold of the bicentennial celebration, Olmsted 2022. We could say, why not, as a celebration of Frederick Law Olmsted, the sort of godfather of our American park system, why not save more lands in these areas? And evidently, Frederick Law Olmsted actually did, in fact, write a letter to Charles Pond regarding this issue. I think we can all find our North Branch in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and recognize that there's areas that we can protect. And how do we do that? We voice support for the need to protect things. We recognize that they provide exponential benefits for healthy ecosystems. If not recreational benefits, they provide habitat and they provide ecosystem service benefits, such as generating oxygen and cooling the planet. And so we can voice support, we can ask our elected officials to conserve and revitalize state and city property. We can ask institutional property owners like colleges and universities and hospitals to form a mosaic of preserved pieces along our riparian corridor. And this is a critical time, not only because the climate crisis is, of course, we're on this countdown of we need to do something within 10 years, but we also are on the threshold of having the federal government develop a Green New Deal. In Connecticut, there's the Governor's Council on Climate Change. The reports have just come out, and we are asking that there be an implementation process, a series of pilots across the state where the Governor's Council on Climate Change can not just affect general policies, but also show real evidence of change. And then for the North Branch of the Park River, the MDC, the Long-Term Control Plan, or the Clean Water Act, there's over, I think, $500 million to $1 billion on the table about removing the combined sewage overflow impacts from that river. And then again, as I mentioned before, Olmsted 2022. So where are we in the midst of all this? In the midst of all this, this is the Park River Regional Watershed, a 78 square mile watershed within sort of north central Connecticut. We're wrapped around by the Farmington River watershed here that stretches up into Massachusetts. And of course, this is the greater Connecticut River watershed that stretches up into Maine. And I'm guessing that most of the people on this call are going to be familiar with these maps. Yet looking at them again, we can sort of see why throughout the 20th century, the main focus has been on protection of landscapes that weren't in urban areas, and that the sort of sense that these urban areas, as someone once said to me, were sacrifice zones, that there really wasn't much that could be done about them. But fortunately, that's really changed, where we're beginning to realize that if we want the majority of the population to not sprawl across our across our rural areas, create the sort of excess suburban sprawl, we need livable cities, and livable cities mean having nature in the city. So this is a view of the North Branch. The North Branch is a 1/3 of the Park River Regional Watershed. So the northern third of the Park River Regional Watershed is the North Branch, and that's what we're focusing on today as a case study, but I am absolutely certain there's an urban-suburban river somewhere in your neighborhood, wherever you live, that needs a little attention and then has very similar conditions, if not as dramatic as the North Branch, which was, of course, part of the North Branch. The last, I think, mile of it was actually half mile of the North Branch is buried, and then it converges with the South Branch underground under I-84, that twisty section of I-84, and pops out at the Connecticut River. And then when we're on the Metacomet Ridge, if you happen to be hiking on the New England Trail and get to Hugh Blind Tower, and you look east across towards the Connecticut, towards Hartford and the Connecticut River, you would be looking across the Park River Regional Watershed. So that's just a sense of where we are. And this is what land use maps sort of tell environmentalists. This is probably from like the 2000s, so I'm sure land use maps are getting better. But for a lot of regional environmentalists who are looking at maps, looking at areas to protect, you see this sea of red and you think, parking lots, there's nothing here. But the reality of it is, for people who live in the city, one little spot, this little spot right in here, that's barely even registering on this map, is this sort of glorious zone of wildness, of urban wild in the neighborhood where I live. And that's what got me started on this process of trying to understand how do we conserve nature in the city in a holistic way. And that work again led to collaborating with the Farmington River Watershed Association and Fuss and O'Neill on the North Branch Park River Watershed Management Plan. And they analyzed the sub-watersheds, Fuss and O'Neill in particular, Washbrook, Beemansbrook, Phillybrook, Tumblebrook. 68.4% of Bloomfield flows into the main stem of the North Branch. This is the main stem, that last blue section, only a sliver of Hartford, 11% of the watershed is within Hartford, 17% is in West Hartford, and 68% is in Bloomfield. So the North Branch of the Park River is actually impaired before it comes into the city limits. These are the sort of conditions that cause impairments, the erosion, the outfalls. This is probably a storm sewer outfall permitted. And then this is where the opening of the conduit, at Farmington Avenue down here. So those are what is recognized are the impairments, the cause of impairments. And along with the research of the impairments, one of the realizations that Fuss and O'Neill drew out of the water quality studies was that there were areas that were surrounded by forest within the impaired zone impaired segment, the North Branch within the city of Hartford, where the water quality actually improved. And this is a picture of the winter section of that river, where the water quality, and I don't know if improved is the right word, but it was just better water quality after testing. And then further downstream, down here, where again there were outfalls, the water quality deteriorated again. But our main interest was that upstream section of the fact it was brought a lot of hope to what cities can and suburbs can do. They don't have to start at the top of the watershed and work down. We can work on different segments and clean up and improve our urban rivers throughout our communities. Of course, it would help if it would certainly help if the upstream communities would minimize the amount of pollution they're sending downstreams. But Hartford, the work we've been doing for the past, I think, 10 years, 5 years now, has been to build green infrastructure features in Hartford along the North Branch of the Park River. And those green infrastructure features, basically our effort is, this is a this is not the parking lot we were working on, but it shows how all the runoff from the top of this building, from this parking lot would just flow as designed straight into the river, right? This was an older design, what we will call a 20th century design, something back like when you had to dial a telephone instead of using your own iPhone or your internet. All of those design and engineering strategies, which are really dated now, just like old style phones are dated now, or old style TVs and computers from the 20th century are dated now. These designs for parking lots and for drainage in cities are as dated as well, and we need to upgrade them. And that's what green infrastructure offers to us. So this diagram just shows what, the floodplain buffer with, what's ideal in different areas. Wildlife habitat, the ask is 300 feet of floodplain area. In the city of Hartford, we're just asking for 50 to 100 feet. That's what we want to get back. And in areas where we can't gain that footage for floodplain, for infiltration of water, what the green infrastructure can do is we can fold the floodplain in essence into the section of the green infrastructure, so we can amend soils and sort of dig a swale with amended soils that can capture the volume of stormwater runoff from the parking lots. I think many of you are familiar with this technique. These are the design drawings for the 3 bioretention basins that are built within at 110 Sherman Street. And this is the work under construction, so you can see the depth of the green infrastructure features. And this was when it was first planted. And this is what it looked like a few years ago. I have to say right now it's full of cottonwoods and other trees that seem to be growing back out of the forests. And I'm realizing that these edge conditions are now that we've introduced so many new native shrubs, that they're benefiting the birds, and the former tree canopies are coming back as well. It's quite exciting, more I think from a habitat perspective, but it's also doing the work of capturing and infiltrating water in the city. So these are our challenges. When we first started this work, the idea of COVID-19 far in the future, money is always an issue, and climate change now we know is accelerating. And so my thinking has evolved too, from the work that we began on these smaller scale implementation projects to trying to take on a larger landscape issues. And the New England Landscape Futures Project out of Harvard Forest has helped give us Park Watershed and a team with Susan Messino from Trinity College and the Sustainable CT, an F opportunity. The maps that were created across New England and to study the way forests will change because of population shifts and how subtle differences in the way culture chooses to develop in the future will really will render our forests, our landscapes is significant. And so the significant differences in the quality and the character of landscapes in the future. And that's been a fabulous opportunity for me to work on. I recommend you all go and check out this and spend a little time with it, spend a little time with the scenarios, but most of all, spend a little time recognizing that this idea that we can design our future and by engaging our neighbors. And I have to say that's really kind of full circle from where I came from, because I studied architecture. My background, my parents have a doctor, medical. My mother's father's a doctor. My father is in agriculture. And so seeing on how we design at a large scale makes sense to me. And the other piece of the New England Landscape Futures project that was so important to, given the work that I've been doing this year, is, and Park Watershed, is this sort of opportunity to look more closely at the trees and the relationship of the trees to the river, because the trees were, again, most of the 319 work, the work with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the Watershed Management Plan, it was about the watershed and how do we achieve clean water within a heavily developed, context, the city and suburbs. But with the trees, we see, and some of the opportunity for getting to clean water does seem like a long haul. I mean, it took us over to 100 years to achieve the impairments. And the upstream development is only accelerating some of our challenges. But meanwhile, the trees are offering this very positive story. They're turning out to be the heroes and the sheroes of our climate challenge. And I think we should embrace that by recognizing the work that they do, and that it's the more mature trees that are doing the majority of the work. And this, again, I underscore the good work of Susan Messino and Dr. Messino and Dr. Muma, in recognizing that mature trees need to be conserved because they offer the most benefits. And this mature tree that you just saw here, these big limbs there's 16 trees basically held up by this tree that just happens to be at the side of the road right across Asylum Avenue. And but it's not unusual along the riparian corridor for us to find these larger trees. And while there are large trees throughout the city of Hartford, the recent storm Aisha has underscored that many people see trees as a liability, and these headlines foreground how the bad trees have like knocked down power lines and kept people off the internet and blocked roads, and they must be cut down. Like that's a lot of what the message has been coming from our electrical companies and our municipal managers, is that these older trees that become frail and may lose a big limb, and when they lose a limb, it's usually big, come down. They need to come down in public areas. So all of the benefits of mature trees are being removed from public properties, from city streets, from our homes and parks due to perceived or real risk. And I could just show you picture after picture of trees that big trees, big, beautiful trees that I've seen come down all over our parks and city and neighborhoods in the past, recently, even before Storm Aisha. And what's being replaced is there's a lot of happy tree planting events with community groups, and which is great. I think that's important, but I really question one, are these cultivars, evidently there's not very many studies showing the survivability of the cultivars. Should we just simply stop mowing and allow the indigenous plants to be coming back in certain areas? Will the indigenous species from the seedlings of the existing tree stock actually be more formidable in the face of climate change? Those are questions we haven't really asked at this moment. But along the riparian corridor, a lot of those issues dissipate because nobody's really paying attention, which is fabulous. Actually, it's fabulous for the trees because there's leaf litter. A tree can fall over, it can decay falling over, it can stand there as a snag and provide multiple habitats. The best thing about walking around in the forest along the North Branch, one of the best things is there's you can look up in the trees and you can see the holes for habitat, the nesting. There's a lot of nesting that goes on in these tree snags along the river. All of those trees would be removed from a public park or from a city street immediately because they would be deemed a hazard. And I suppose rightly so, but it's just that that's the benefit of the riparian corridor, is that dynamic river that floods and wanes and changes course also becomes a habitat for the dynamic life cycle of trees, which also have their own characteristics of hazards that we can't necessarily live next to. And so when we look at the North Branch of the Park River, we can see the forest density along the river here. You can follow my cursor. This is the North Branch, and you can see the forest density largely overlooked. Again, this would barely make it into a spot on a land use map. And this is Elizabeth Park. So this is the preserved land within the city, and much of it's being utilized for recreational purposes. It's being used for tennis courts, for baseball diamonds. There's 2 baseball diamonds here. There's a dog park. They've just built a little entertainment center. There's a Rose Heritage Garden. There's more tennis courts. So most of our public parks, I was an acting chair of the City of Hartford Parks Commission, and that's when I realized that there was this tension between what once was, casual play in parks, and now is the construction of fields, such as athletic fields that are for the development of people, recreational or little leagues, that are actually a pipeline for people's jobs because in professional sports. And I'm increasingly recommending that communities everywhere start to rethink where we're placing athletic fields, especially college level or sort of high school level athletic fields. Once you get to a point where you need lighting, where you want a synthetic turf field, where you need parking, where you want concessions, that becomes a money-making field that ought to be moved off parkland that was historically designed to be a glimpse of nature in the city. And again, the North Branch, it really has rebounded from, this is the North Branch in 1934. So we can see how few trees there were in this area at the time. This is Hartford Golf Course over here, and here's Hartford Golf Course over here. So it give you some sense. And now because it's just basically been overlooked landscape along the riparian corridor, all of these trees have been able to grow back and thrive, and that provides a whole host of ecosystem service benefits. And so this is a map I borrowed from. I didn't borrow it. Patrick Cummins kindly shared this with me. I think it's a screen grab from something else. But you can see our population of New England is rising, and our forests in Connecticut have the forest area is beginning to percentage of unclave area is beginning to decline. We have this tension between the forest area and our rising population, and we need cities that are not promoting a commuter lifestyle. We need cities that are going to provide areas where people can walk to and encounter extraordinary landscapes, such as along the North Branch. So here, this is a major route into Hartford. It's Asylum Avenue, right? You can't see it, but the North Branch is right behind there. And 100 years ago, so right behind this car, this is the North Branch. There's a bridge right here. That's the river. So 100 years ago, a little 150 years ago, in 1897, this was what that landscape looked like. There were very few trees in the area. This bridge was replaced in 1957. But I show this picture here to show how denuded the river was of trees at that time in 1897, which was the beginning of the landscape movement, where Frederick Law Olmsted began to, and others like Horace Bushnell, began to ask that there be city parks to capture the beauty of nature, the beauty of what they found in New England. And I think this is the beginning, this beautiful park here, Bushnell Park, which is a tiny speck on the landscape, was the thinking of a network of people related to Frederick Law Olmsted, who moved on to New York City to design Central Park. And each of these parks in the future, these parks, all these other parks, this park over here, they all came later. And of course, our national park system is also linked to Frederick Law Olmsted. So the growth of national parks was really a cultural movement as much as it was actually, that's really what it was. It was a cultural movement. And I think we can do the same thing. I show this picture again to sort of ask the question, do we need a perfect rectangle? Do we need these sort of pieces along an emerald necklace, the charms of Jamaica Pond, of Arnold Arboretum, and Franklin Park? How do we encourage elected officials and communities to see the riparian corridors as whole places that need to be conserved and revitalized in the 21st century in order to mitigate climate change and to create ecosystem service benefits? And there's many schools along the North Branch, so that's one argument, is that this is a learning opportunity, that we can have citizen science stations along the North Branch. That would be one strategy. I'm not sure we can have mass events along the North Branch, as this is in Bushnell Park and Hartford and that, but outdoor gatherings. And right now we have not convinced the city of Hartford, this is their plan of conservation and development. They haven't recognized the North Branch as a whole area. They did recognize the need to continue work on the North Branch Park River Watershed Management Plan. And they are beginning to see the need for bringing agriculture into the city and embracing the notion that that urbanity can include the kind of relationship to agriculture, to farms, farm to tables, to that provide a whole host of health and mental health benefits. And, you know, in Hartford, I have to say this has been extremely important because I'm not from New England, and I have been struck by how tarnished Hartford's image is in the area, and uh, the recent review of the redlining mortgage lending practices that were enacted during the New Deal have kind of brought to light some of these entrenched and lingering perceptions about urban neighborhoods, which I actually love cities. I love nature. I love cities. I think you can have both. It's just a matter of design. We design these things. We can design them again. Nature in cities is not a new thing. There's many examples going back in time. Publicly managed spaces in urban areas is a relatively new project of the American democracy. In the redlining practices, what they did was they identified areas that were considered hazardous, definitely declining, still desirable, and best. These were used to orient mortgages, support mortgage lenders would use these maps. What was considered hazardous was actually sort of these reprehensible evaluations or judgments of people's character. In this situation, in this example of quote unquote clarifying remarks, it's about Jewish families and that how they're labeled hazardous in New Haven. In Hartford, you can see how West Hartford was best, the West End was still desirable, and in much of the Asylum Hill area is definitely declining, and then downtowns and North End and the South Ends were hazardous. Now, these red line practices have presumably ended, but I guarantee these perceptions have lingered on, and the lingering perceptions, you know, impact people's ability to have jobs, people's willingness. So many people from outside of the city come in and have jobs in Hartford. I think, you know, a third. I think that morning commute into the city is something like 70,000 people. I forget exactly, but it's a stunning amount of people drive in. Of course, they don't do that anymore for jobs in the city of Hartford, whereas the majority of a wide number of people in Hartford are unemployed, and people in these institutions rarely go out into the communities anymore because of their perception of them. And this perception isn't just it's impacted the structural character. And the New York Times did a recent study over the summer of tree canopies in redline neighborhoods. This was in Richmond, Virginia. And you can see the historic neighborhoods, also named the West End, had more tree canopy than the redlined neighborhoods in Richmond. And the lack of tree cover translates into higher summer temperatures, and those higher summer temperatures and the noise pollution and the air pollution in areas where the density is combined with excess automobile, aka commuter traffic, has increased the death rates and health impacts on those communities. And I must say, I don't have the statistics, but they were surprising. The summer heat index can go from 5 to 20 degrees hotter, depending upon where you are in different parts of the city. Obviously, these red dots will be the hottest areas in the urban heat island. And again, when we go back to this picture, we can see those are areas that are treeless. So this notion that our trees are, you know, the planning, we can plan trees in our neighborhood, we can plan we can plan corridors of nature that can bring these kind of cooling temperatures and channel microclimates. These can all be designed. Actually, in Toronto, they're designed for cold weather and wind drafts. So this work can be done. We just have to decide to do it and make a process of it. And many planners have not focused on that. The planning has been to allow manufacturers and large companies to move upstream. So for instance, Colt manufacturing, we see the Colt Onion Dome. We think of it as a sign of Hartford. It's actually located in West Hartford, and it's allowed to permit in discharges, sediments and metals along into the Trout Brook. And when Trout Brook meets Piper Brook, it flows into the south branch of the Park River, which is also impaired. And so this was a study of all the metals companies that are in the area around the West Hartford town line. This is the West Hartford town line here. This is New Britain Avenue here. All of these are permitted discharge points. They are all strategically placed at the downstream portion of Trout Brook, just above the Hartford line. So there is no taxes paid in Hartford. None of these companies pay to support protecting the river downstream or revitalization of the river downstream. It's all just part of the procedure. So these are the types of policies that could be changed, that if these companies are going to be permitted to discharge into the river, then they could certainly pay to help revitalize the river downstream from that. This is a picture of Bloomfield. So we're back on the North Branch now, and currently the Bloomfield Planning and Zoning has high density in its downtown area, and you can see there's high density residential development in these neighborhoods of Hartford. But in the future, the town of Bloomfield had actually planned a much higher density development throughout its eastern portions of its city. This will absolutely cause more pollution and flooding downstream. This is a floodplain parking lot that's owned by the state of Connecticut downstream from all the development in Bloomfield. And we have been trying to get the state for years to release this parking lot so it can be restored as a floodplain. So on one hand, the agency, the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, we are working literally across the river to improve water quality. But on the other side of the river, this parking lot, which is owned by a different state agency, we can't get it to be restored. So there's conflicts within agencies where the planners just simply cannot recognize the critical need to restore nature in the city and to minimize impacts to our riparian corridors, all of which can be achieved. This is not rocket science. So again, this is a land use map, and you can see the protected open space. There's no protected open space along the North Branch of the Park River. Even all of those maps that I showed you of the trees that have grown back since 1938, none of that's protected. This is Elizabeth Park. Even though Elizabeth Park is protected, it's largely used for athletic purposes and entertainment purposes. So the real work, I'm closing, sorry, this has maybe gone on a little too long, but we still have some time for question and answer. The real question is whether it's not just me, it's other people in the neighborhood and all communities, whether you want a hog river or a park river in your neighborhood. And again, it's so archetypal, the North Branch of the Park River itself. I find it very archetypal. And I think that it's evidence of rivers all over the area, all over the country. And in 1883, there was worked to change the name of what was being called the Little River to the Park River, and they created Bushnell Park around that. And this anonymous editorial in the Hartford Courant chided readers to drop the name of the Hog River and use the name of the Park River. And this is a map that he refers to from 1796, the first map in the area. And he points out that the river is never on any map as the Hog River, is the Woods River. And in fact, in the West End neighborhoods, there's many areas that are Woodland Street, Woodland Terrace, Woodside Circle, etc. So it makes sense to see this historic map with the Woods River. Here's the North River, was actually Trout Brook. This is the Little River. This is the Connecticut River here. This is one of the first maps of rivers in the United States, or back then in 1796, the colonies. So what is it going to be? The Hog River or the Park River? It really takes a community to design whole areas. And I see the riparian corridor in the past. Landscapes for parks were sort of parcels that got selected for various reasons, but we need to increase our thinking so that there's some multi-layered co-benefits, and those co-benefits around the riparian corridor couldn't be stronger. And we know things can change. Of course, this is the tribal lands, and that were managed in a very different way than our developments have chosen to manage our lands. This is an example of a mosaic of ownership and management along the Mianus River in southwestern Connecticut. And I put this up here because I think that this is probably the best example of what urban rivers can hope for. This is maybe a larger scale, but I think different parcels can be owned and managed by different property owners within an urban area, and that again, to create a kind of mosaic of protection. And this is the North Branch, and it shows, this is the University of Hartford land. These are, the red are K through 12 schools. The white is residential property owners. There's a church in here. So there's already a mosaic. Now we need those institutional property owners, those communities, to say, we want to save this landscape, this ecosystem, for its ecosystem service benefits for future generations. Why? Again, I'm hoping this audience really understands that, our generation, maybe we were born in here, but this is where the population, it's a hockey stick population, and we need the co-benefits of restored stream corridor, open space, green jobs, real estate values. We need to mitigate climate change, reduce urban heat island. We need to improve urban quality, create recreational areas, strengthen flood control, expand habitat, conserve energy and water, renew our urban forests. It can all be done. Oh, this is a great picture of the Anthropocene. We are in the Anthropocene. It doesn't have to be a building. We can rebuild nature, and we can start by conserving and then assisting the revitalization nature of nature in our cities. And with that, that's it. So I'm gonna hit stop share, and I think I went over a little bit, but how's that?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mary. So there is one question, and I will encourage folks to throw things in the Q&A or in the chat, or just raise your hand if you want to ask Mary a question. But the one question that was sent in through the Q&A, Mary, is from Jake Lehen. And he says, thanks for sharing your experience in the Park River Watershed. As a city, Hartford and surrounding suburbs are likely MS4, municipal separate storm sewer system communities that also contain EPA listed impaired streams. I've been advised against pursuing EPA non-point source pollution funds 319 and 604B in MS4 communities. Can you talk more about your experience applying with the EPA funds in urban areas where stormwater sewer inputs are likely to cause impairments?
So the 319 project, as he said, it's the 319 projects are section 319 in the Clean Water Act, and it's a federal mandate. And during the Obama administration, the restrictions on how the monies could be used got tighter. This is my understanding. And I work as a contractor with the North Central Conservation District. So the implementation projects that we completed with the North Central Conservation, I coordinated them. We worked with Fuss and O'Neill, North Central Conservation District, and other conservation districts in Connecticut. I don't know where Jay, is that who's asked that question? Jake, where Jake is he in Massachusetts or is he in Connecticut? We don't know. But that's one of the things. Is the first step is you have to have a watershed management plan. So the 2010 North Branch Park River Watershed Management Plan, which is online, it was approved by EPA. It is over a decade old, but it does all the homework on showing how in implementation project, where they can be so they actually will result in clean water. So that's the main goal of the 319, is that they need to have a demonstrated ability to remove nutrients and contaminants. And you need a fair amount of study for that. So that may be why he's being deterred from seeking 319 funding, that his area may not have a watershed management plan, and there may be other priority watersheds in the vicinity that he would be competing against. That's the only reason why I'm thinking. But it's interesting because the MS4 phase, which when I first started this work, I was told that there would be funding available through MS4 for public education. But it turns out, and that's a requirement, right, that of the Clean Water Act, that at a certain threshold in time, MS4 would kick in, and that MS4 would have certain implications, and one of those would be that there would be funding for public education. Well, it turns out a lot of these municipalities or the water company like MDC, they'll put out some brochure or whatever and say, see, we educated people, right? And so there's not as much education about the about the evolved opportunities as we had hoped. Does that answer his question?
I think so. Let us know, Jake, in the chat. He also said he's in Massachusetts, not Connecticut.
Okay. Yeah. It might be that he should actually go to the Connecticut River Conservancy or go to his local watershed stewardship organization and perhaps find out if they have projects underway, and maybe he would join a project underway and then help evolve his work.
Mm-hmm. Great. Or maybe Mass Rivers Alliance. They might have some information on that.
Yeah.
Great. Anybody else have any questions for Mary? Thank you so much, Mary. This has been really terrific. And I have been recording it, so it'll be available. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, why don't we talk for a minute about, if another question doesn't come up, since we have like a few more minutes.
Sure.
About, because I know you do the Paddlers Trail and you do a lot of recreational, and I have to say, I like, it's so fascinating to me, like how many people want to swim in the river, and it's like, and actually I did kayak down the North Branch of the Park River. When I first got started, we got in at the University of Hartford, and it took us 5 hours to float downstream. It was kind of, I don't know, the reason why it took us 5 hours is because we had to portage over so many log jams. But I've had sensitive skin and skin eruptions for many years, and I knew I just like it was hard for me to do that. But the person who I kayaked with actually got in the water up higher. And I remember thinking, I used to kayak in Colorado and the water was so clean you could easily drink out of it. And it's a visceral sense that this water needs some attention. I have this very curious visceral sense of need to support the water. And yeah, I don't know. Tell me what your experience on. Do you kayak on urban rivers, Kristen?
I have, yep. And I've done most of the Massachusetts and Connecticut stretch of the Connecticut River. I haven't done the northern part. It's definitely varied, right? I mean, you do get to places. I mean, I was really struck by paddling into Hartford, how wild it is. As you pointed out, you know, I have this great photo of wildlife and then the skyscrapers. And it's really pretty stunning. And I think that, you know, upriver, you know, around Springfield as well, you have that experience where it's just kind of a mishmash of highways. But then when you actually get on the river, it's really wild. And, you know, you see osprey and bald eagles and turtles and fish and, you know, many other things. So, you know, I think it has a lot to do, obviously, with what's happening on the land. I mean, I know even I live close to one of the mill rivers here outside of Northampton, and there's a dog park, and the pollution is off the charts, you know, from a lot of the waste. So I think, as you say, there might be an impression about how clean a water source is, especially if it's in a city. But, you know, I think watersheds can be impaired in any different landscape. And it might be a misnomer to think, you know, that it would be more so in a city. So I think it really kind of varies. But I know in Massachusetts, I've gotten in the river quite a bit. I would say in Connecticut too. You know, there are places where you kind of know that maybe there's some outflows. Yep.
You're mostly on the Connecticut River, which is a pretty big river. I mean, the volume of water. Whereas the Park River is, I mean, you know, maybe 50 feet. I mean, it's just not a wide river, and and the volume of water traveling through it. I mean, it has huge surges, right? I mean, because the flash flooding from the shunt of stormwater runoff from upstream development will send the water. You know, the water flow rates will change, you know, 4 to 6 or more feet depending on the size of the storm. And you know, like the University of Hartford, a lot of it went underground, you know, underwater. But yeah, so are there tributaries like the Scantic when you're kayaking? Do you venture up these sort of smaller tributaries that may, you know, reach into the regional tributaries to the Connecticut? Do you venture up on them, into them?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on the Deerfield and the Farmington. I honestly haven't done that much paddling in Connecticut since I paddle pretty much close by to home. But I was just going to say we're at 12:30, but I wanted to mention, Mary, that Chris Malik said in response to the questions about the MS4 that municipalities must meet their requirements for MS4 permit registrations. 319 funded projects can only be used for work that is above and beyond conditions required for permit registration compliance.
Yeah, Chris is with the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, so he's got the right answer. It's a very detailed process, and I'm very grateful to the North Central Conservation District for handling the paperwork on this. And I like to do the coordination work and the field work, and you know, and making sure that, you know, the plants, you know, survive the summer of drought, and so and take pictures and catch sinkholes and things like that. I like that. So yeah, it takes a team. And I hope everybody. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope we, you know, I love the Friends of Conte, because I do feel like the beauty of watersheds is they kind of show how we all connect together in our own respective places. So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mary, and I'll make sure that the recording gets out to everyone and all the Friends of Conte and others who couldn't attend today. Thanks so much for the great work you're doing and for the information.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. All right, bye.
Bye-bye.